Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on this national webinar to hear from U.S. Representative Jamie Raskin about his new book, Unthinkable, Trauma, Truth, and the Trials of the American Democracy. I'm Ron Halber, the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington. Before we begin, please note that this program is being recorded and closed captioning is enabled for the Zoom. The JCRC of Greater Washington serves as the public affairs and community relations arm of the Greater Washington Area Jewish community, the third largest Jewish community in the United States. We represent the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington and more than 100 synagogues, organizations, and schools to advocate for the needs and values of the Jewish community and for the well-being of everybody in the region, including the most vulnerable. The JCRC is focused on government relations, advocating for Israel, combating anti-Semitism, strengthening ties with other communities, working in our region's school system to ensure a welcoming environment for Jewish children and all youngsters, and Holocaust education and commemoration. We are strongly committed to cultivating a society based on freedom, equity, justice, and pluralism. Before I introduce our moderator and speaker, I want to encourage our audience to participate in today's program. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A module on your Zoom screen, and we will get to as many of them as possible in the time that we have today, which is approximately 1 hour. Today's program is being moderated by Thorn Posen, my friend who serves as Vice President of the JCRC of Greater Washington and co-chair of our DC Commission. Professionally, Thorn is a partner at Goldblatt Martin Posen, where he advises private companies, private and public institutions, and government entities on local government, government ethics, campaign finance, and land use and administrative law issues. Previously, he was a partner in the Government Solutions Group in the DC office of Stinson, Morrison, and Hecker. He also served as a special counsel for the District of Columbia government, as chief of staff and counsel to a DC council member, and on the staff of the DC Financial Control Board. In private practice, he has over 25 years of previous experience working with and for the District of Government. I'm also proud that we have my friend Congressman Jamie Raskin with us today. He has proudly represented Maryland's 8th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives since 2017. Prior to his time in Congress, Congressman Raskin was a 3-term state senator in Maryland and the Senate Majority Whip. He was also a professor of constitutional law at American University's Washington College of Law for more than 25 years. He has also authored several books, including the Washington Post bestseller, Overruling Democracy, The Supreme Court versus the American People, and the highly acclaimed We the Students, Supreme Court Cases for and About Students. Congressman Raskin is a graduate of Harvard College, Harvard Law School, and a former editor of the Harvard Law Review. Thorn, take it away.
Welcome. Thank you, Ron, for that very generous introduction. And Congressman Raskin, it is indeed an honor and a pleasure and a privilege to have you with us, at least virtually. I look forward to some point in the near future being able to sit down and have these types of conversations in person, but virtually for now, and thank you. First of all, I want to reiterate what Ron said off the top, and that is that to our online audience, if you have questions, as you think of them, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to make this as interactive as possible with you. And to you, Congressman, I want to say first of all how moved I was by your book. I'll put another plug in for the title, Unthinkable, Trauma, Truth, and the Trials of the American Democracy. And I really look forward to talking about that book with you today. By way of background, except for a small family connection and a daughter the same age as your daughter, your younger daughter, my view into your world comes mostly as a former law student of yours. But with that, I've been able to see firsthand really your passion for the Constitution and the rule of law. Ron mentioned we the students. In fact, it was at the time that I was your student, a new version, a new edition of that book had come out, and I saw your devotion and passion for dealing with high school students and their connection to the Constitution, and the Marshall Brennan Center that you were one of the founders of, and worked with high school students and getting them to understand the power and frankly limitations of the Constitution. And it's with that focus on young people that I want to start our conversation today, if that's okay with you. First and foremost, I want to say how sorry I am for your loss. I never met your son Tommy, whose death is at the center of the book, and I thought maybe we could start with you telling us a little bit about Tommy, about in particular his activism, his poetry, and what you described so movingly as his perfect heart.
Well, hey, Thorne, thank you very much. It's great to be with you. It's great to be with Ron. It's great to be with everybody across the country who've come together for this. And I'm grateful to you. And Thorne, I should say, I take great pride in your career as your law professor. I recall you were in my local government law seminar, I think, back in the day. And I don't think you were my constitutional law student, but in any event, I've watched your career with great admiration. So yeah, I mean, I thought you had met Tommy, but Tommy was a remarkable young man. He was a remarkable boy. He had a dazzling mind, photographic recall. He was a poet, a playwright. He started writing plays when he was a little boy. He wrote poetry to the very end of his life. And he loved to perform his poetry, and he would get up and he would recite it. And he really got into it in the last few years when he became a vegan and a very staunch proponent of people not eating animals. And he wrote a lot of poetry about that, basically answering the question, why are you a vegan? Or, why don't you eat meat? And so he wrote a number of remarkable poems on that theme. And one of them is called Where War Begins. And we're in the process of collecting Tommy's own work, his essays and his poetry and his plays. And we'll be doing something to publish them, I hope, this year. But look, Tommy, what was special about him was his heart, because he just had an infinite reservoir of compassion and love and friendship for people. And he was a great friend, and his friends have been, bereft and crushed like we have been to lose him. But a lot of them have made new friends in the course of the last year. But Tommy had infinite compassion for people he didn't know. And that's what was so remarkable about him. I mean, he felt the pain and the suffering of people, children dying in the Yemen civil war and victims of gun violence in our country. And things like, the murders at the Tree of Life synagogue just destroyed him. I mean, he felt these things like it was happening to people in our family. And ultimately, I think that just remarkable and extraordinary and endearing quality was connected to his depression, which got him in the end. He left us a farewell note on the last day of 2020, which said, "Please forgive me my illness one today. Look after each other, the animals, and the global poor for me. All my love, Tommy." And that note captures a lot of his sensibility and his love of the world. And when he said, "all my love," that was accurate, because that's what he gave really to everyone in our family and his friends and everybody he came into contact with. He gave all of his love to the world before he left us.
That's beautiful, and I know how difficult it is to be talking about this, and maybe to open the lens a little bit wider. You speak in your book, and I think make the connection in your book to the importance of mental health to not just to our families, but to the vibrant democracy. And you speak openly about the need to speak frankly about suicide. And I know that even before COVID, so many of our young people were in a very dark place. I think many of them see the world as broken in many ways, and the political system is broken in many ways. And I think maybe in my view, our view, I see the arc of the moral universe being long, but bending towards justice over time. And I see so many young people not seeing that, not looking at it over time. And
Yeah.
and I'm wondering how you take that from your personal perspective as well as from your perspective as a congressman to address young people and give them some hope about the future.
Well, my dad used to say, when everything looks hopeless, you're the hope. And I grew up with that sense, and we taught that to our kids too. And, it has been an extremely difficult time for everybody. I mean, we live in a time of a lot of trauma and a lot of difficulty. And there are some big questions that are on the minds of young people, beginning with climate change. And all the polls show that young people take it far more seriously and feel it far more personally than, middle-aged people do and older people do. But that's not all. I mean, 800,000 families have lost people to COVID-19. No, more than that now, 900,000. I mean, we're on our way to 1 million people in America, more than 5 million around the world, but comparable numbers we've lost in the opioid crisis, which has ravaged communities across the country, gun violence, drug abuse, alcohol abuse. There is a mental and emotional health crisis engulfing young people. The Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, declared a national emergency in the emotional and mental health crisis of young people, of children. So it's not just people Tommy's age in their 20s, but it's adolescents, it's high school, and it's younger. And COVID-19 has been devastating in terms of the isolation and the demoralization, the interference with people's educational lives, their professional lives, their social lives, their ability to form relationships. It's just been a nightmare. And, the only silver lining to that is that much of the stigma surrounding mental and emotional health issues is gone, because we're talking about a majority of the kids. A majority of young people report intensified symptoms of anxiety, depression, and all of these other things. Of course, it's very closely connected, I think, to our political condition. And it's a nightmare for our politics, because, if we want to have an authoritarian, autocratic dictatorship country, then we don't have to worry about the health of the population. But if we want a democracy, then the physical and the emotional and the mental health of the population are essential. They are a prerequisite to us being able to be a democracy, because we need people operating at their best in order to be active agents of self-government and self-help. And that's what democracy is based on. So we've got to take this crisis very seriously. Obviously, everybody's on an individual odyssey, and lots of, people have a particular diagnosis and medication and doctors, and we've got to take that very seriously. And we have to try to live up to the idea of mental health parity, that we're making an investment in mental health equal to what we invest in medical health. We're nowhere near realizing that yet, and there are parts of the country that are just remarkably short of the mental health resources that they need. But in addition to that individual investment we need to make in each person's mental health, we need to uplift the kinds of social determinants we have in mental health. And part of that responsibility, I would say, falls on political parties. A political party should not be undermining people's mental and cognitive and emotional health by pumping lies and propaganda, disinformation, and conspiracy theories into the bloodstream of the country. That has a profoundly demoralizing effect on people. My dad used to say that democracy needs a ground to stand on, and that ground is the truth. And I think that's also accurate for each of our lives, that we have to base our lives as much as we can on the truth and facts and emotional truths, and not on lies and disinformation and propaganda.
Well, let me move to the January 6th attack, and you were there in the Capitol. That obviously was, I think, to some degree, a culmination of that lies and lack of truth and propaganda, if you will, as you say. Can you speak about, first of all, why you were there? I understand from the book that there was, there was some thoughts about maybe not going that night, but that you were, or that day, that you were asked to be there and went, and what it was like when you found that there had been a breach of all things, the Capitol by a violent mob. I just, what goes through your mind during these things? And maybe
well, I was there, Thorne, because I had a constitutional duty to be there. The 12th Amendment commands Congress to meet in joint session the first Wednesday in January after the presidential election in order to receive and count the Electoral College votes. And that's what I explained to Sarah and Hannah and Tabitha and the rest of our family, that was obviously still in profound mourning at that point. We buried Tommy in Montgomery County at the Garden of Remembrance, which is our Jewish cemetery in Montgomery County, on January 5. And Tabitha especially had been urging me not to go in on January 6th. And I just said, I had to. We've got to count the Electoral College votes. I'd been preparing for months to help the speaker lead the response to all of these fraudulent objections that were being advanced about Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, a handful of other states. Also, we had a very slender majority at that point after the 2020 elections. The Democrats were still in control of the House, but it was just by a handful of votes. We were in COVID-19 lockdown. People were coming down with the disease every day. People's family members were coming down. People were afraid to travel. I live closer to the Capitol than any other member of the House, other than the non-voting delegate, your friend Eleanor Holmes Norton. But I simply had to be there. And that was how Tabitha and my son-in-law, Hank, who had eloped in the summertime with our daughter, Hannah, unbeknownst to us. I guess that's what it means to elope in an Elvis Presley wedding in Nevada, but let's let bygones be bygones.
For another day.
Tabitha and Hank both decided to come. And so most of our family was still back home, but they were with me. In fact, I think they were really the only kids. I mean, they're in their early 20s, but the only kids who were there that day because of COVID-19. And this is sort of an unremarked aspect of the luck that prevented a real bloodbath on that day. Most of our staffs were not here. There were very few staff people here, and nobody's families were here, as far as I know, other than my family and I think the speaker's family and Vice President Pence's family. So the Capitol Police were able to protect a mercifully shrunken down population. But if we'd had the normal thousands of people around, it could have been a much greater nightmare than it was.
Well, how did you think it was going to end? I know you've spoken about sort of how it started, and we saw scenes of members of Congress, perhaps yourself included, pulling out these World War II, Korean War era looking horrible gas masks that I didn't even know that there was such a thing there in the Capitol.
Yeah.
What was
well, we didn't know how those gas. we had gas masks, and then they said, pull out your gas masks when, the speaker was escorted out of the chamber, although she left her phone. Other Democratic leaders, Republican leaders were escorted out. There was a terrible barreling sound into at the main door, the central entrance to the House floor, as the mob tried to pound their way in. And then we all started getting messages asking, were we okay, telling us that there was mass violence taking place outside the building. And even then we had no idea of the character of what was taking place. I mean, I had always assumed if one person tried to elude the police and to enter the House of Representatives or the Senate without going through a metal detector, they would be shot dead on sight. It just never occurred to me. It never entered my imagination that you could have hundreds and hundreds of people storming the Capitol and laying siege to the Congress of the United States. But I do tell the story methodically as best as I could reconstruct everything that happened. And it was a nightmare because Tabitha and Ryan were with Julie Tagan, my chief of staff, hiding in Steny Hoyer's office right off of the House floor. And they had locked the door, barricaded themselves in, pushed all the furniture up against the door as people were pounding and chanting.
You were separated. You were on the.
We were separated.
House
I was
chamber,
still,
and then that must have been.
Yeah,
I
I was still on the House floor. And when someone sent me a picture of the insurrectionists bearing the Confederate battle flag in Statuary Hall, a few minutes away from where we sat, and I looked at it and I went over to Liz Cheney right across the aisle and I said, Liz, it looks like we're under new management. And she just shook her head and she said, what have they done? And then it was just basically chaos. I mean, we had a new House chaplain who was on her third day on the job who got up and said a prayer for everyone. People were calling their spouses and their kids saying goodbye because nobody knew. And of course, the first thing that goes through your mind these days is, Tree of Life or the Pulse nightclub or Newtown, Connecticut or El Paso, Texas, that you think that someone is going to show up with an AR-15. And of course, as Lindsey Graham said on that day, all of us could have died. Someone could have a bomb. We were very lucky that the mob, which had come up from right outside the White House where Donald Trump was speaking to them, had been checked for weapons on their way into Trump's rally. And so that's why, as a lot of the extremists reported, they had left their weapons in their cars or their motels or hotels. That has left their firearms and their knives, not all of them, but most of them did. But what they ended up using as weapons to attack our officers were steel pipes, baseball bats, Confederate battle flags, Trump flags, American flags, hammers and screwdrivers that they stripped from construction workers who were building the inauguration scaffold on the west front of the Capitol. And all those things were turned into weapons. And of course, our officers were overwhelmed and besieged, and 150 of them ended up wounded and injured with broken jaws, necks, vertebrae, arms, legs, several lost fingers, toes, gouged eyes, traumatic brain injuries, post-traumatic stress syndrome. These are Capitol cops, Metropolitan Police Department officers, Montgomery County police officers. A lot came over from Virginia. These people were absolute heroes, patriots of the First Order who saved us from the worst of it. Obviously, people died that day, as you know, but no member of Congress died, even though there were extremist groups, neo-Nazis, who were saying things like, get them all into the basement and gas them all. That didn't happen. These people, Eugene Goodman and Officer Dunn, my constituent, Officer Fanone, who just heard about it and came over and joined the battle and was nearly killed. And his life was only saved after he begged for his life, saying, I have 4 daughters, don't kill me. These people saved our lives. They saved our democracy too, as Mike Pence did, until the National Guard could get there. So, I mean, and I'm happy to talk about, what the plan was targeting Pence if you want to hear, Thorne. my best understanding of what was going on.
Well, I mean, I think it's important, a couple of things, but yes, I mean, I think it's important to understand and to get an understanding of sort of how close we came. I mean, how, but for the heroic actions of a handful of law enforcement and others, what was the, what would have been the alternate history there?
Well, I mean, and that's true of all of those people, Officer Gunnell and Dunn, Officer Hodges, who was the officer who got caught in the doorway, who screaming. He was basically tortured in front of the whole world. He was stuck for, I think, somewhere around 8 or 9 or 10 minutes in that pattern where he was being beaten, sprayed in the face with unknown chemicals or bear mace while he was screaming for his life. And when he got out, they went back with him, helped him to calm down. They washed out his eyes, and he went back out and he fought for another 2 hours. And we have members of Congress who won't even vote to support a commission to examine these events and the causes behind them, to make recommendations on how to secure and fortify democratic institutions. And he went back out to fight after he was tortured in front of the whole world for many minutes. I mean, it's hard to come up with words to describe the heroism of these people. I mean, Eugene Goodman, by drawing the crowd towards the left of the chamber rather than the right, prevented the deaths of many people, all of us feel, basically by tricking the rabid mob that was, chanting "Hang Mike Pence." But I got to say a word for Mike Pence. I mean, he did his job. He maintained his oath of office when other people, obviously Donald Trump did not. A lot of people didn't, but he did. And Trump couldn't accept the results of the election. First, his strategy was to try to get GOP-controlled legislatures to nullify popular election results and just appoint slates of electors for Trump. And he tried to do that in Ohio. He tried to do it in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, a bunch of states. He was willing to do it. Ohio, he ended up winning, but Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, the GOP legislature said no. They wouldn't do that. And so then he turned his attention and that of his subordinates to trying to coerce state election officials to revise the vote count and to find votes. So he was caught on a recording with Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger of Georgia saying, "All I'm asking for is 11,780 votes. Just go find me 11,780 votes." He wasn't trying to stop the steal. He was trying to effectuate the steal.
Yeah,
he wasn't trying to stop election fraud. He was trying to commit election fraud, and he was trying to get Brad Raffensperger to do it. But he's another unsung hero of that day because he refused to do it. I mean, he said, "I'm a lifelong Republican. I gave to the Trump campaign. I would do anything within the realm of law to support him, but I'm not going to fix an election. I'm not going to steal an election." But that's what Trump wanted him to do. When all of that failed, they turned their attention to Mike Pence, and they wanted him to announce again lawless, unconstitutional powers that had never been exercised or claimed before, to unilaterally reject and repudiate electoral college votes coming in from Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, some other states. But the first three were the ones they really targeted. They just wanted to get Joe Biden's vote total from 306 in the electoral college to below 270. At that point, under the 12th Amendment, the contest would be thrown immediately into the House of Representatives for a so-called contingent election. And why did Trump want a contingent election in Speaker Pelosi's House of Representatives, still under Democratic control? Well, they understood that under the 12th Amendment, we don't vote one member, one vote, we vote one state, one vote. And The GOP had 27 state delegations. We had 22, and Pennsylvania was split down the middle. Even had the at-large representative from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, my new best friend in Congress, even had she defected from the GOP coalition to catapult catapult Trump back to the presidency, even if she'd said she wouldn't participate, they still had 26 states in the bag, and they would have run it like the Republican convention. They would have declared Trump the winner. He would have seized the presidency for 4 years, and likely he would have followed the advice of Michael Flynn, his disgraced former national security advisor, who served for 17 days before he was forced to resign after he lied about his contacts with the Russian ambassador. He would have followed Flynn's advice, and he would have invoked the Insurrection Act and declared martial law, at that point calling in the National Guard to put down the insurrectionary chaos he had unleashed against us.
Wow. Well, I mean, I guess we'll hear more about this. I take it in your other role with regard to the January 6th Commission. We hear about pieces of this in the news, and look forward to hearing more. It's remarkable. It's unbelievable, and I do understand. In the book, you reference that despite all this pandemonium and issues going on, that in fact you weren't scared. I think it was the words that you used. That the worst had happened to you, that you had lost Tommy, and that you had him with you, and that was a comfort that carried you through this day of days. Like no
well, and I was most concerned to get Tabitha and Hank out alive, and I felt no fear for myself. I mean, I felt as if I had already lost what was most precious and cherished to me, and I felt a lot of anger about what was taking place. And as I figured out really what was going on in these 3 concentric rings of sedition, I got more and more angry and more determined to tell the truth to the American people. I mean, you had this outer ring of a mass demonstration that turned into a mob riot that Donald Trump had called for a wild protest. And many of those people were innocently motivated. They were coming for a demonstration. Others came spoiling for violence. There was a spectrum of intentions on display that day. There was a middle ring of the insurrection, and that was the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers, the Aryan Nations, the state-based militia groups, the First Amendment Praetorian. These were armed domestic violent extremist groups that had been planning for weeks. Many of them engaged in paramilitary training for weeks to come to Washington. These were the people that operated as a vanguard front line to smash our windows, attack our officers, and essentially show the crowd how to do it, how to turn that crowd into a mob riot, and then come in and shut down for the first time in American history the counting of electoral college votes and the peaceful transfer of power. And they did that. And believe it or not, that wasn't even the scariest ring. The scariest ring was the very inside ring, the ring of the coup. And I understand this is an odd word in American political parlance because we don't have a lot of experience with coups. We think of a coup as something taking place against a president. This was a coup organized by the president against the vice president and against the Congress in order to essentially set booby traps in the electoral college with counterfeit electoral college certificates, phony contests, and then setting the stage for the vice president to reject electoral college votes and set up this contingent election that would result in the then president, seizing the presidency for another 4 years. And so a lot of what we're doing in our committee is examining the interplay among these different levels of activity that were going on.
Remarkable. Let me, before we sort of jump to the to that piece, I want to come back a little bit in the book, and then we'll come back to the commission and kind of moving forward. The impeachment, obviously a key piece, in the book. I take it that before the work that you were able to do on the commission and learn more about, even more about these layers of sedition and malfeasance and craziness, if you will, was the work that you did, as the manager in the impeachment, and sort of to take the anger that you referenced, the need to try to find not just the truth, but perhaps accountability, which is the word I'd like to hear more about these days. So can you speak a little bit about the impeachment? We could take the entire rest of our time going into the nuances and the strategy and the work that you did there. But what do you think it says about our politics, that despite the fact this was actually obviously the second impeachment of Donald Trump, and that it ended with your work and your colleagues' work with the most bipartisan result, I believe, in history. Correct me if I'm wrong there, but at the end, it still wasn't. And with all the evidence that you had, even at that time, more so now. But even with all of that, it couldn't end in a conviction. And so, what does that say about the former president and our politics today, and where Mr. Trump is today in our world?
Well, first, Speaker Pelosi really threw me a lifeline in a personal sense when she asked me to be the lead impeachment manager and to organize the team and to develop our strategy and our legal case against Donald Trump for inciting a violent insurrection against the Union, the first time a president had ever done that in our history. And I say she threw me a lifeline because I wasn't eating, I wasn't sleeping. I was a wreck, and the truth was I didn't know whether I would ever be able to do anything again of meaning or substance in my career. And at that lowest moment, Nancy said, "We need you, and we need you to do this." And it was a lifeline for me. She forced me to rally, and I carried Tommy with me in my heart and in my chest throughout the entire experience. And we had a remarkable team, and we had a great team of lawyers. And I tell that story in the book. I think that the case that we brought was absolutely overwhelming in terms of the factual evidence. It was irrefutable, certainly unrefuted at the trial. And I know a lot was made of the quality of Trump's legal representation. A lot of people were making fun of the lawyers and so on. And I think some of that is unfair because they were not given anything to work with. I mean, there were no facts on their side, and all the law was on our side. I mean, they ended up saying, well, there's no precedent for impeaching and convicting a president for incitement to violent insurrection. So this is the Raskin doctrine. They kept talking about the Raskin doctrine. And I got up and I said, you're right. This is the one thing you've said that I agree with. There is no precedent because from George Washington to John Adams to Thomas Jefferson to James Madison, James Monroe, all the way through, George W. Bush and Barack Obama, it never occurred to another president to incite a violent insurrection against his own government. So if that's the Raskin doctrine, then I accept it. I will, I will wear that as a badge of honor. Most law professors, most members of Congress never get a doctrine named after them. So I'll take it. But that's a sign not of my originality, but of Donald Trump's originality. But look, your point is correct. It was the most sweeping bipartisan result in a Senate impeachment trial in history for a president. There have only been 4 presidential impeachment trials in the Senate: Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, which was ridiculous, of course, Trump 1 and Trump 2. And this was by far the most bipartisan result. Usually it's just a partisan lockdown. Mitt Romney crossed party lines in the first impeachment to vote to convict on 1 count. But we had 50 Democratic senators, 7 Republican senators from every part of the country, the Northeast, the Midwest, the South, the West, Alaska, from all over the place joining us, 14% of the Republican caucus. But it is true, Donald Trump beat the constitutional spread. We did not get to 2/3. We would have needed 67, not 57, and we were 10 Republican votes short. I will say that I think that we convicted him in the court of public opinion. We convicted him in the eyes of history, and I think we convicted him in the prism of the world. I think that the world understood what he had done, and I believe he is a persona non grata in American politics generally, but I don't know, because it is true he has only strengthened and consolidated his control over the Republican Party, which I hesitate even to use that phrase because it's really Donald Trump's party at this point. It's not Abraham Lincoln's party. And they're operating now much more like an authoritarian religious or political cult of personality than they are a modern mass political party. So we are still in the thick of this struggle to defend democratic institutions and to defend democratic values. To me, this is the way that I feel my book was a labor of love for my son and my country. I feel right now we are all in the fight of our lives to defend the democracy that we've inherited, so we can bequeath a democracy to our children and grandchildren.
Well, let me just go back and talk for a minute about trauma, which one of the subtitle words from the book, and this trauma that we're in, and the trauma that we face in dealing with defending democracy. There was a point that you raised there that I thought was fascinating, and I'd like you to expand on it just for a little bit. And that is, you said in your grief in dealing with the trauma that you faced with the loss of your son, you reached out to others and friends and looked back to the Greeks and Romans and how they had dealt with these things, and with the help of some friends and some thoughts on yourself, that you thought that if there was a god of trauma from an ancient god of trauma, that it would be Janus, this god with two faces, looking back and looking forward at the same time. And I thought that analogy was fascinating and had some sort of hope in it in some ways. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you're plunged into the depths of despair, I'm sure a lot of people listening have had a similar experience. I mean, you turn not only to your own tradition and your own faith, and I got a lot out of Judaism and different Jewish philosophers and writers, but you turn everywhere. I mean, people were sending me all kinds of stuff from all different directions, including a lot of poetry that was very valuable to me. But I called a friend of mine who's a professor of classics and political science at Howard University, Norman Sandrich, and I asked him whether there was a Greek god of trauma, and he said there's not a Greek god of trauma, but we set about to imagine one, and we imagined him just like Janus, a god who would look forward and backwards at the same time. And the god of trauma says, I will cheat you of everything that is most precious to you, that is most beloved to you, that you treasure the most, the things that make life worth living to you, and it will strip that from you. It will take joy right out of your life. But if you stick with it, you will be connected to humanity generally in a far more profound way than ever you were before. You will be able to understand other people's experience and other people's loss and grief and tragedy in a way you never did before. So what you will lose in terms of joy in your life, you will be compensated for in wisdom. And I imagine saying to this imaginary god of trauma, well, okay, that sounds interesting, but that's not really something I want to do. I don't consider that a fair trade. And that's the catch. The god of trauma says, it's not up to you. You have to accept it.
And I think on a maybe a more hopeful note, and recognizing the predominantly Jewish audience that we have today, and our host, the Jewish organization, I want to talk a little bit about your Jewish values, and I've heard you speak about this even before January 6th, and I point out that we share a Jewish home in Temple Sinai here in Washington, and a wonderful rabbi, Jonathan Roos. who I know has given me great comfort in times of difficulty. But when you were speaking in the past about how your Jewish values have shaped you as a member of Congress and your views as a member of Congress, you've spoken about the Jewish concept of tikkun olam and repairing the world. And it struck me that this is even more of a time with the trauma that we were speaking about and the challenges and difficulties and loss that we've had. And in some ways, I'm drawn to the idea that Tommy was looking to repair a broken world through his activism. And I'm wondering if this is something that's even more.
Well, there's no doubt he was. I mean, Tommy taught Sunday school, actually, not at Temple Sinai, but at Temple Manuel. And he believed really strongly in that fervent mission. He felt the pain of the world. He felt the suffering and the injustice in the world. And for him, that was a call to action, an urgent call to action that he felt every single day. And it was a mandate for moral commitment, and constant moral renewal of purpose. I think that, I feel extremely connected to our community, to the Jewish community, and this experience has made me feel connected to people all over the world who have suffered this kind of terrible loss. And we are living in a time of trauma, and I'm hearing from lots of people who've gone through this kind of thing. And I want to make sure that we're giving the young people a sense of hope that by confronting the truth of these things and talking about them, we can work them through and we can move forward to renew our society and our democracy. I mean, this is an extraordinary gift that we have received. I mean, for most of the history of our species, people have lived under kings and queens and dictators and pharaohs and bullies and kleptocrats and autocrats. And, when Lincoln stood on the battlefield and asked the question whether government of the people, by the people, for the people shall perish from the earth, it was not a rhetorical question. He was asking, will it, or are we willing to do the things we need to do to make it go forward? And we can feel that same kind of moral intensity today about everything we're doing. We have to defend the free institutions of democracy, the courts and the press and the Congress and the right of the people to assemble and the rule of law against people who would try to tear the whole thing down. And there are authoritarian governments and leaders and movements all over the world that are rooting for the end of American democracy. And you know who they are. It's Putin in Russia, and it's the anti-Semite Orban in Hungary, who runs all of his campaigns against George Soros, and it's Duterte in the Philippines, and it's El-Sisi in Egypt, and Bolsonaro in Brazil, and you name it. And they are betting on the failure of American democracy. But what makes us so great, what makes us exceptional, is that we are, even with everything we've just been through, the world's greatest multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious constitutional democracy, and the people have constantly struggled to create a more perfect union. And Thorne is one of my students, how I teach the Constitution as a chronicle of the struggles of the people to overthrow injustice in the past. So the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, and the 14th Amendment gives us equal protection and due process, and the 15th Amendment ends race discrimination in voting. The 17th Amendment gives us direct popular election of senators as opposed to the legislatures. And the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage. And the 23rd Amendment gives you and your friends in DC the right to participate in presidential elections. And the 24th Amendment ended poll taxes, and 26th Amendment lowered the voting age 18. All of it is about expanding and deepening and concretizing the ideals of democracy. And Tocqueville said, democracy is always either shrinking and shriveling away, or it's growing and expanding. And we've been in a contractionary shrinking mode, and we've got to get back on the road to democratic expansion and Congress and universal inclusion. That's where we're headed. That's what we need. And so we're in a serious fight here. We are really in the fight of our lives.
And you see in looking forward, hopefully through some of your work, your colleagues' work on the January 6th commission, perhaps as a truth and reconciliation commission, perhaps you see a path forward, and voting rights, and of course DC statehood, which I have to throw in a word for, and some of the climate change issues and other large issues that face us. You see a path forward there?
Well, I hope so. I mean, the alternative to a collapse into insurrectionism and coup and authoritarianism is going to be an expansion of the meaning of democracy. It's going to be a fortification of our basic electoral institutions, the right to vote, and it's going to be an expansion to include millions of people who are not fully equal citizens now, including Washingtonians, including people in Puerto Rico, including former prisoners who remain disenfranchised in 7 or 8 states. We need everybody's participation, and we also need to pay attention to the emotional and mental health of the population so that people are ready and prepared to engage. And we have to stop trying to drive people out of politics by making public life so nasty and so ugly that people don't want to have anything to do with it.
So we're kind of running down our time. It was one sort of truly beautiful thing that I saw towards the end of your book, and I just wanted to set it up and then give you an opportunity to speak to that. I did have a couple of a fun fact I wanted to ask you about as well, but it's a little off subject. So the conclusion piece that I wanted you to discuss was to go back to that duality that we talked about with regard to trauma and our your imaginary God of trauma, and you pointed to trauma, and I wanted to talk about the other kind of main focus of the book, which was unthinkable, the main word in your title. And in the book, you focus the word unthinkable on its mostly on its most sort of visceral meaning, tragedy that was so awful it defies thought, such as losing your son and the January 6th insurrection. But in the end, though, you bring up the possibility that unthinkable could mean something much more positive, something good that's just beyond people's, maybe their common vision. Unthinkable is unthought of, or maybe not yet imagined. And with that, I'm reminded of Robert Kennedy's, one of his favorite quotes, where he said that most people look at the world as it is and they ask why, rather than looking at it as it could be, and asking why not. And I'm wondering if that's really the flip side of unthinkable in a tragic sense. And that was really maybe Tommy's vision of the world, of a better world. And I'm wondering what your thought is on that.
Well, I talk about how Tommy confronted the unthinkable in both senses, even from a very young age, when he became aware of war, when he became aware of the Holocaust and genocide. He was pretty demolished by the whole thing when we first went down and saw the Holocaust Museum, and I think he was 13 or 14, but he didn't talk for several days after that. And so he was willing to look at and absorb the emotional meaning of that kind of unthinkable. But he also, as you say, imagined ways of organizing the world that wouldn't depend on people's suffering and depending on people's oppression. And he used to say, people thought that slavery was just a natural fixture and part of social and legal institutional life. So we could leave slavery behind. Why couldn't we leave war behind too? Why couldn't we make human rights violations a thing of the past? Could we get to a point where we left poverty behind the way we left slavery or witchcraft behind, witchcraft trials? And so he would look at social practices that we just accept as inescapable or inevitable and say, that's a growing pain of humanity. We can get beyond that. And so, I don't want Tommy's life to be reduced to the last couple of days and what was so unthinkable about losing him. I don't want American democracy to fall apart over the unthinkable events of January 6th. I'd rather focus on those things that are presently unthinkable that can become imaginable and we can make real through the democratic process. And we need to do that because we're facing other forms of negative unthinkability, like the horrors of climate change. So we've got to be able to imagine what it would be like in our society to get beyond producing so much carbon gas that we're doing in our chances for surviving the future. So that's an unthinkable prospect that we're just going to destroy ourselves by unthinkingly blundering into the end of the world. We have to try to imagine other ways of operating and unify humanity around saving ourselves from the worst possible catastrophes.
Well, that's wonderful, and thank you. And but before I let you go, I guess there are two things. One, we just saw across the wire that Justice Breyer may be retiring at some point in the near future. So I take it that you and your colleagues in the Senate may have an opportunity to change the scope of the Supreme Court, and hopefully these issues will be front and center in the most positive way. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts on that and how that proceeds going forward. I don't know if you have any comment on that now, or certainly something we can look forward to talking to you.
Yeah, I'm afraid the arithmetic on the Supreme Court is such that I'm not quite sure. Even if we replaced him with Professor Tribe, I'm not quite sure it would fundamentally change the character of the Supreme Court today. But let's hope that Mitch McConnell doesn't come up with a reason for why we're too close to the next presidential election to conduct hearings.
It's after the first year. It's at the new rule. I think it's
right.
After the first year of the office. It's too late. Well, we'll stay tuned, of course, on that. And then one fact, I believe, I wanted to confirm this though, and that was in my my due diligence here. I saw that your mother's mother was apparently very good friends with, I'm going to say best friends with, but let's just say good friends with Bob Dylan's mother in Minnesota.
Zimmerman.
And
Well,
I'm wondering if that's a true fact or a alternate fact.
No, it is true. But my grandmother was her Hadassah chair, and I think she was co-chair with Mrs. Zimmerman in Minnesota.
In Minnesota, yes.
My mom grew up in Minneapolis, and that's where Bob Dylan grew up too. But I never met Bob Dylan, but Mrs. Zimmerman was part of our life growing up.
Well, 6 degrees of separation there. Wonderful, and thank you for confirming that. And thank you so much for your time, Congressman, and for talking to us. And I know that many of these topics are not easy to talk about, but so important. And your thoughts and optimism are incredibly appreciated. And thank you so much for your service to our country as well.
Well, thank you, Thorne, and I'm very proud again of everything you've done. And thanks to Ron Halber and everybody who's out there. Unfortunately, I can't see on my gallery view everybody who's there, but I've been very touched and moved by all of the letters and emails about the book, and I'm glad that people are reading it and engaging with it. And as you suggested, Thorne, there's a lot in there on a lot of different things, and so there are different things for people to engage with, and it means a lot to me that people are doing that.
Well, with that, the book is, and I'm just coming back to get to the full name here, Unthinkable, Trauma, Truth, and the Trials of American Democracy. It is a wonderful read and an important book, and thank you so much, Congressman, for talking to us about it today.
All best.